making a peppermill, specifically one with a Celtic knot. I'm going to go ahead and share screen so we can get started. And here we go. All right, so I'm going to be talking about this specific peppermill, and let's see what we got here. All right. I assume everybody can see what I'm presenting.
Yep.
And we'll be ready to go. So this presentation really comes in two parts. One part is how to make a Celtic knot, and the second part is actually how to make a peppermill. The Celtic knot can be used in a variety of turnings, in addition to peppermills, just any spindle turning actually. And it looks complicated, but it's really not that hard to make. And the Celtic knot is not about the turning, it's all about the blank. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. So in this peppermill, you can say I have a maple peppermill with a black walnut Celtic knot. So we're going to go ahead and take a blank. This is a maple blank for a peppermill, and we're going to add the black walnut to make the Celtic knot. So this diagram represents the blank, and this is from SketchUp, and it's in what they call X-ray mode, so you can kind of see how things are going on inside. So this is the plain maple blank, and what we want to do is insert 4 pieces of walnut into the blank in order to make the basis for the Celtic knot. You need to cut through the blank and insert walnut from all 4 sides. So this represents the first piece of walnut, where you cut through the blank and glue in a piece of walnut at an angle, and then you do a second piece, and now you can see there's an X pattern through the block from the top to the bottom in the black walnut. And then you want to do and repeat that from the sides as well. So this is the next one that would go in, and finally the 4th one here. And when you turn this arrangement, the Celtic knot will appear. So now this diagram represents the block, not in X-ray mode. And the important thing to see here is that the 4 pieces intersect cleanly at the corners. And they intersect as well cleanly in the center. For this to happen, the corners all have to match. When you make the cut through the blank, you have to use a consistent angle for the cut. The cuts have to be made the same distance from the end of the blank, all 4 of the cuts. And the pieces you insert need to be the same thickness as the amount of material you remove when you make the cut. So the question is, how do you make this happen? And as it turns out, it's actually pretty easy to do on a table saw. So we'll start with the blank itself. Now this peppermill requires a 3-inch square blank. And of course, I don't have any 3-inch square material hanging around. So what I did is I took some 2-inch maple and I milled it down, and then just took 2 pieces and glued them together into the blank. So that's one first pretty easy step. So now I need to make cuts through the blank and insert the walnut. So I'm going to do this on my table saw, and I'm going to use a full kerf 1/8 inch thick saw blade, which means that I'm also going to insert 1/8 inch thick pieces of wood. So the first step would be to mill up some material to insert in, and I can do that on my planer. An 1/8 inch is about as thin as you can, actually is as thin as I can do on this planer, and that's actually pretty thin for milling anything. You have to make sure you have a nice straight grain piece of wood. If you're going to be doing that, if the grain is not straight, the planer will just shred your piece of wood when you get it down to this thickness. So you do want to be somewhat careful about what you use for material here. So, okay, I'm going to plane my material down, and I need to make sure that it's the right thickness. So I just took a piece of maple and ran it through the table saw to make a slot so that I can make sure that the piece I'm going to insert is the right thickness. It fits tightly into the slot made by the saw blade, but you can actually get it in and doesn't wobble around. So, okay, I've got a piece of material I'm going to use to insert as I make each cut through the block so that it's the same thickness as the cut I'm going to make. Next thing I need to do is figure out how to make the cuts at a consistent angle and in the same position on the block at each of the 4 cuts. So you can make some sort of fancy jig, but that's not really necessary. And this is about as simple as they come for jigs here. What I did is I took my miter gauge and I attached a piece of plywood to it with screws. There's little slots here on the back of the miter gauge for that. And then I set an angle that I'm going to use to cut through the block to make the Celtic knot. The angle isn't actually critical. It needs to be consistent on all your cuts, but it can be whatever angle you want. The steeper the angle, the taller the Celtic knot will be. And the shallower the angle, the shorter it will be. So you can go from something that's quite round to something that's kind of long and oblong, depending on the angle you pick. Now for this Peppermill, I've got the angle gauge set at a little over 50 degrees, as you can see here on the picture. But like I say, the angle wasn't critical, just something that I thought would make a Celtic knot the size I wanted. Okay, so the next thing I had to do is figure out where I want it to appear on the block, and I wanted my Celtic knot to be roughly centered in the body of the block. In the body of the Peppermill. So I figured out, when I ran the block through the saw, where it would come out, roughly centered, and I just put a stop block here on my very simple jig, and I just nailed this onto the other piece of plywood. And that's it for the jig that controls that angle. It allows me to do a consistent angle and a consistent distance from the end. Nothing very fancy. All right, so now I put my block on there and I'm ready to make that first cut. So I'm going to put 4 pieces of wood in. So I'm going to cut through this block 4 times, 1 from each side. And that's going to be done in stages where you cut through once and then you put in the walnut and glue it up and wait for it to dry, and then you turn the piece and do it again. Now this is an important step. Okay, so you can see that I've cut this one through and then I turned off the saw and took this picture. Now you notice I didn't actually cut all the way through the block. You can see there's about 1/8 inch of material left up here on my block. And this is very important in getting your pieces to be properly aligned. If you cut all the way through the block, when you insert the piece of walnut, you have to somehow keep the block aligned. If you make your block, your blank for your Peppermill just a little bit too bigger than it needs to be, and you don't cut all the way through, this keeps the 2 halves aligned when you go to insert your contrasting piece of wood. And here again, you can see the slot has now been cut through at an angle. And I've got the side that's not cut down on the table. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these pieces of black walnut and I'm going to put glue on it and slide it down into the slot. All right, so nothing real fancy here. Took some tight bond too, piece of wood, spread some glue in the slot, put glue on both sides of the piece of black walnut, and then I took the blank with a small piece of wood on the table, put the side that is not cut down on this piece of wood where the cut is, so that I could press down and flex the slot open a little bit. I wanted to open this slot a little bit so I could slide the piece of wood in. So once I did that, I slid it in, made sure it was all the way to the bottom, and then I just clamped it from the end to apply pressure to the joint. And this is where having not cut all the way through the block works great. I don't have to have something to try to keep this half and this half aligned. They're already attached to one another. All right, great. So now you can see here, I'm using Titebond 2 as my glue, which means that I have to wait overnight before I can do the next cut. Now, it's very tempting to say, well, I could use 5-minute epoxy, and then I could only wait a couple hours. And instead of taking 4 days to make one of these blanks, I could do it in a day. Well, I've tried that. And the problem I ran into with that is that the epoxy is thicker than Titebond 2. And once you get it in the slot and then you put your piece of wood in here, you go to clamp it up, and it's hard to force the extra epoxy out and get a nice, clean, tight joint. So I don't really recommend the 5-minute epoxy route, even though it's very tempting, just because the epoxy is thick enough that it's hard to force it out of the joint and get a nice, clean joint here. All right, so now what I'm going to do is wait for that to dry, flip the piece around to another side, and it doesn't even matter which one, as long as this one you have it already cut through, and run it through again and make another slot, and then put another piece of walnut in and glue it up. Now, one of the problems I've run into, which is easy to fix, is I've got the section I didn't cut all the way through down on the base of it, down here on the table. So when I go to clamp this from end to end, it may twist here at the top. These two pieces may start to twist out of alignment. Now the part I didn't cut through at the bottom holds the bottom nice and square, but here at the top, depending on how thick that piece at the bottom is and how strong your wood is, this may start to twist, but that's easy to fix. I just took a C-clamp and put it across the joint and forced these two halves into alignment just by putting pressure across the piece. So this takes some time, and you have to repeat this, 4 times through, but it's really very easy to do. Once you've got the jig set up, you just run it through, glue the piece in, wait till the next day, run it through again, glue the piece in until you've done all 4 sides. Okay, so once I did that, I went ahead and stripped off the extra 1/8 inch of material that I had left where I wasn't cutting all the way through. And you can see this looks very much like the picture I had before, where you've got the 4 pieces of wood intersecting pretty cleanly at the corners. And at this point, this is all it takes to do the Celtic knot. It's pretty much done. So now I want to go ahead and turn the block and think about making a peppermill out of it. So the first thing I do when I'm going to do that is I just take a compass, make a circle on the block, and figure out how much waste I can cut off the corners. This just makes it easier to turn. So I just set my saw blade at 45 degrees, run my blank through the table saw, and chop the corners off. Now I've got a blank that's ready to go for peppermill, and it already has a Celtic knot in it. So I'm going to mount it up on my lathe and then turn it. And as you can see, as soon as you make a cylinder out of it, the Celtic knot appears. It's already in the blank. So, and there is your peppermill blank with a Celtic knot in it, rough turn. So that's all there is to making the Celtic knot. It requires essentially no turning skill at all, just some skill in making a blank. And this scales to different sizes and different projects. You can put it on just about any spindle turning you want. It's not restricted to peppermills or salt mills or whatever, that sort of thing. So now let's talk about actually making a peppermill. So this is the second part of the presentation, which is, okay, how do you make a peppermill? I have a roughly 3-inch blank that's been rough turned that has enough material for the body of the peppermill and the top of the peppermill and some waste material up here for grabbing onto the piece and manipulating it. So let's talk about peppermills. Now, I bought a peppermill kit, this specific one from Wood River, and this peppermill kit comes with all the parts you need for the grinding mechanism and a little metal top, and then it comes with 4 different shafts, so you can make any one of 4 different length peppermills. That's one of the things that you need to be a little bit accurate about, is the actual length of the peppermill, because this shaft has to fit properly in the peppermill and allow you to screw the little knob on the top here where this is threaded to control the peppermill as far as how much it grinds. So you can get this kit from Woodcraft and other places, and you can get kits similar to this from other manufacturers. This particular kit I like because it comes with the 4 different lengths, and then I can pick whatever length I want out of that. So if you go to Woodcraft's website, this is what you'll see when you go to look for this pepper and salt mill. And you can see it's the same 4-shaft kit as I had there in the previous picture. So this is a pepper mill, and this is a salt mill. And they are identical, except that the grinding mechanism in the pepper mill is metal, and the grinding mechanism in the salt mill is ceramic. Other than that, they're identical. They work exactly the same way. All right, so you've got your kit. You need a few other things. You're going to need a 7mm bit to drill a hole for the shaft. You're going to need a 1 1/16 Forstner bit to drill through the body of the pepper mill for where the peppercorns will be stored. And then you need a 1 5/8" Forstner bit to make a larger hole in the bottom to where the grinding mechanism goes in and is held in by a metal plate. And since Forstner bits are fairly short, you'll probably need a Forstner bit extension in order to be able to drill as much depth as you need, unless you're making a very short pepper mill. Then, of course, you'll need your stock, which we've already prepped, and you'll need some jam chucks or some other way to hold the pepper mill after you drill out the holes in it. And we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so here are the parts I need. Here's my 1 5/8" drill, my 1 1/16 drill. This is my drill extension. This is my 7mm brad point bit. And then you can drill these on drill press if you wanted, but I like to drill them on the lathe. So I need this Morse taper drill chuck that goes in the tailstock of my lathe. So that's another part you're going to need if you're going to drill on the lathe. All right, and then you need something to hold the piece as you drill it. So that would be a 4-jaw chuck, and I'll show you how that's used in a minute. And I'm not a big fan of jam chucks, so I actually bought a small set of jaws for one of my 4-jaw chucks that can go inside the 1 5/8" hole on the pepper mill and hold it in place of a jam chuck. All right, so continuing on, in order to drill on the lathe, so I've got my blank rough turned, and at this point I want to drill the holes in it. And you might think, well, why don't I just drill, why don't I just turn the pepper mill and then drill the holes afterwards? Well, as it turns out, no matter how careful you are when you're drilling those holes, they don't come out exactly on center. So the normal way to do a pepper mill is to rough turn the blank, then drill the holes, remount the blank using the holes as your center point, and then finish turning it. And that ensures that the holes are actually in the center of the pepper mill. Okay, so I want to drill this pepper mill on my lathe. So I need some way to hold on to one end of the piece so that I can drill out the other end. So this is actually the top of the blank. And this material down in here is the top of the pepper mill, and further to the right is actually the body of the pepper mill. And this is actually not the pepper mill that has the Celtic nut. So in the next few pictures, you won't see a Celtic nut, but don't worry, it didn't magically disappear. This is just a different pepper mill. All right, so in order to use the 4-jaw chuck, I make a tenon in the end of my blank, and then I put a small slot up here, which the four-jaw chuck has a lip on that'll go into that slot. So here you see I've now got the blank mounted in the four-jaw chuck, and you can see here's the tenon, and here's the slot, and here's the little lip on the four-jaw chuck that actually grabs onto the tenon and keeps the piece stable. All right, so here's a shot of the whole thing. I've got the four-jaw chuck, I have the entire blank, and this is the bottom of the Peppermill, this is the top. I've got my 1 5/8 inch Forstner bit, I've got my drill chuck mounted in the tailstock, and you'll notice that if you're going to drill on a lathe, you can't use a short lathe. This is a jet MIDI lathe, and you can see right here is the beginning of the extension for the MIDI lathe. If I didn't have the bed extension, I couldn't drill this size Peppermill on this lathe. I wouldn't have enough bed length to do it. So when you're considering drilling on the lathe, you need to think about how big is your lathe and whether or not you have enough actual real estate in your bed to accommodate all these parts. The four-jaw chuck takes up a few inches, the blank takes up a fair amount, and then you've got all these other hardware that goes in before you that you need real estate for in order to get your tailstock securely on your bed. Okay, great. So here it is, another shot here. It's ready to go. And now we're going to go ahead and turn on the lathe and advance the tailstock in order to drill the hole. You want to be a little bit careful about the depth of this hole because this is where the grinding mechanism goes in. And the critical depth on your Peppermill is the distance from the grinding mechanism to the top, because that's the length of that shaft. You've picked one of 4 shafts, and you've only got about plus or minus a 1/16 of an inch to play with there as far as the length goes. So you want to get that right. So you want to drill this to pretty accurately the depth they recommend. Now, if you drill it too deep, all is not lost. You just have to adjust the height of the Peppermill to make up for the fact that you drilled this hole a little too deep in the bottom. All right, so I drilled the 1 5/8 inch hole in the bottom where the grinding mechanism goes in and the hardware that holds it in. And now I'm going to switch over to the 1 1/16 inch bit, and I'm going to drill out the body of the Peppermill. So you see I started the drilling here, and pretty soon you've advanced to the point where you've run out of Forstner bit and you haven't got far enough to do the entire Peppermill. So turn the lathe off, pull this whole thing out, and put on your extension here. And now you've got enough length to actually complete drilling the hole. And now you can see I'm really way off onto the bed extension here at this point. So like I say, you need a pretty good sized lathe bed in order to use this technique of drilling on the lathe. All right, so it's back in the hole, ready to drill, and then I've drilled to the depth I want. So now I've drilled all the way through the Peppermill, and we're ready to part off the Peppermill. So now measure the length of the Peppermill as you've decided. So you've got, I'm using I'm using the 8 inch Peppermill shaft for this thing. So my entire Peppermill is 8 inches tall. So I've got the top for the Peppermill and the body for the Peppermill. You have to decide how big each is going to be, but the combination has got to be 8 inches. So I picked 6 inches for the height of the body and 2 inches for the top. So this is a 6 inch line, and using a parting tool, I'm just going to cut that off on a lathe. And I end up with my rough turn blank that's been drilled out. This is the bottom, and you can see we're back to the one with the Celtic knot at this point. This is the recess for the grinding mechanism where it's going to hold it, and then this is where the peppercorns go here in the middle. And then the other end is just the 1 1/16 inch hole that goes all the way through. So now I need to remount this in the lathe so I can finish turning it. that's where the jam chucks come in. Okay, so this one is just a simple cylinder with a tenon on it that's 1 1/16 inches in diameter, and this is 1 5/8 on this one, and you want them to fit into the holes snugly. And then if you put those in the holes, and you can remount the whole thing in your lathe. So I've got a jam chuck on this end, one on this end, and now I've got a piece, and I'm ready to turn it using jam chucks. Now you can buy jam chucks if you want. You can make your own, like these here, or you can use something in place of the jam chucks, which is my preference. So I'm using that 4-jaw chuck with the smaller set of jaws on it. I created a spacer piece here to get the end of the Peppermill away from the 4-jaw chuck so I could actually turn the entire length of the Peppermill without hitting the 4-jaw chuck with one of my tools. And I just go ahead and mount this thing here between the 4-jaw chuck and my tailstock. The 1 1/16 inch hole is small enough that the taper on my live center fits snugly into that hole. So instead of using jam chucks, I just use the 4-jaw chuck and the live center for my tailstock. And you can see I've now made a very simple turning here. It's a slight hourglass shape to the Peppermill. Now this is a pretty beefy Peppermill. You can make them considerably slimmer. There's quite a lot of material here that you can remove and still not end up eating into that 1 1/16 inch hole you drill in the middle. But the more material you remove from the diameter of the Peppermill, the shorter the Celtic knot gets, because these pieces are in here at an angle. So as you reduce the diameter of this, you keep moving down the wood. So when I do something with a Celtic knot, I like to keep the diameter pretty big. Otherwise, you just end up shrinking your Celtic knot to something really small. So I looked at this and said, okay, there it is. Very simple turning, kind of boring, needs something. So I added some beads to the end just to use up the space above and below the Celtic knot. And they're not the world's best beads, but they serve the purpose. And once you get the thing all finished, they look pretty good. So now I just went ahead and sanded the piece on the lathe. You can see this is the only action shot I have. I thought that sanding was safe enough that I actually could do it with one hand and take a picture with the other hand, but the rest of it, clearly I needed 2 hands to work, and then took the picture later. All right, so I've got the body of the Peppermill done. Now I need to do the top. So I'm going to go ahead and once again remount the top using the 4-jaw chuck. So I've got a tenon here, the 4-jaw chuck is grabbed onto, and this is the material I'm going to make my top out of. All right, so here's my top, just turned. Now, when you go to use a Peppermill, it can sometimes be hard to turn the grinding mechanism because the peppercorns can be difficult to crush. So when I make a Peppermill, I like to put a pretty beefy top on it. If you put a little skinny top on it, it can be hard for the people to get enough purchase on it to actually turn the Peppermill and grind the pepper. So when I'm making Peppermills, I tend to put a pretty beefy top on them. If I'm going to do a salt mill, I'll use a much smaller top if I want, because the salt grinds quite easily. Okay, so here's my top, and there's a tenon here. And this tenon goes down into the 1 1/16 inch hole in the top of the Peppermill and centers the top on the Peppermill, keeps everything so that you have a piece that goes all together and keeps the top centered on the mill. Okay, so I need to drill the hole for the shaft that comes up through, that the little nut goes on top. So I just put my 7mm bit into my drill chuck and go ahead and drill this on the lathe again. You get done, and I have my top with the hole down through the center and the tenon that goes down into the top of the peppermill itself and keeps everything centered cleanly. All right, so here it is, all turned, ready for finishing. Now you can go ahead and finish this however you want on the outside. Typically peppermills are not finished on the inside, or if you're going to finish them, I would use something like shellac that's food safe because you're going to put food in them. I also would tend to avoid the exotic woods because I'm not sure which of them are toxic and which aren't. I know maple and cherry and walnut are pretty safe woods. So you do want to think a little bit about what wood you're going to use if you're going to make a pepper mill or a salt mill, because you are going to put food in it. And like I say, if you're going to seal the inside, I would use shellac, which is food safe. To do that, or you can just leave the inside unsealed, and the outside you can finish with just about anything you want. All right, so next, once you've got the thing finished, is you need to put the grinding mechanism in it. This is pretty simple. So this is the retaining ring that goes on the very bottom and holds everything together. This is your grinder. This is the other half of the grinder body. This is your shaft. This is a spring so you can control how coarse or fine a grind you have, and this goes up into where the peppercorns are, and the peppercorns come through these little holes. So all this stuff goes in from the bottom of the mill. This plate here actually goes onto the top, and you can see we've got a square shaft and it's got a square hole in it, and this gives you the purchase to turn the shaft. And then finally this part goes on the very top, a little screw. All right, so here's my top with that metal plate mounted on it. And then here's the whole thing put together. And this one I finished on the outside with polyurethane, actually. It should hold up well for many years, and people will be able to wash it on the outside, wipe it down as they need to if it gets dirty, greasy, that kind of thing. Now, here's where I'm talking about the length issue. The amount of thread sticking up through here is going to be about right in order for you to get the nut on. So you need to be careful about the total length of the peppermill and that hole you drill in the bottom being accurate so that you have the right amount of thread up here on top where you're going to put the nut. And there it is, the finished peppermill. All right, so we've got our Celtic knot, which went into the blank. And then we have the peppermill itself. And now pepper and salt mills come a wide variety of shapes and sizes. Here's another set I did with Celtic knots. On these, I made them slightly slimmer in shape. And you can see this one I reversed the two woods, used walnut and maple, and with the maple being the accent wood. And then on all these, of course, the tops are roundish, I will say. So you can make them essentially any shape you want as far as that goes. And like I say, with a peppermill, I like to put a fairly hefty knob on top so that you can get good purchase on it to turn the grinding mechanism. Now, I'm going to take a little brief detour into a salt mill, which is exactly the same process. This is some salt. I made some Lighthouse salt mills a couple of years ago. And like I said, the salt grinds pretty easily, so I'm more comfortable making this narrower top on that device. It's pretty easy to turn. So this is exactly the same process for making the mill. You take the body, which is this maple piece down here, and you rough turn it, you drill it out with the two different drills, and then finish your turning and smooth it all up. That's exactly the same process that we did for the other one. And then this top is actually made of several sections. This section here, which represents the area where you would walk around the lighthouse, is done in walnut. This section that represents the windows of the lighthouse is maple and walnut, and then I've got a walnut top on here for the roof of the lighthouse. So the window section was actually not that difficult to create. I took a square block of maple and I ran it through the table saw, and I inserted a piece of walnut and I glued it up similar to how I did the Celtic knot, waited for it to dry, turned it 90 degrees, cut it again, inserted another section of walnut, and then glued it up and turned it to a cylinder that was the size I wanted. So now I have a cylinder that I can cut off into window sections for my lighthouse. And then I turned the other components of the top. All right, so here's the base of the top, and it has the tenon that goes down into the peppermill. And here is the little top for the lighthouse. And I did a bunch of these. This was one Christmas. So I did a bunch and I cut these all off and glued them up into individual tops and drilled the holes through them. Then I finished them and I ended up with this whole fleet of peppermint and salt mills, sorry. So this was my Christmas gifts one year. So there's a little bit of initial investment for me in, buying the right size drills and the drill chuck and the 4-jaw chuck. But then I spread the cost out over quite a few different salt and pepper mills over the last couple of years. So I had fun with that. So there's a wide variety of shapes and sizes that you can do these in. You can decorate them in a number of different ways. The Celtic knot on this one is quite versatile. It can be used on a wide variety of turnings, and it scales up and down. You can make things bigger or smaller. So that's my presentation on a peppermill with a Celtic knot. Hopefully, I've encouraged some of you to think about actually making something with a Celtic knot. You can, if you go searching on the web, find lots of articles about how to make Celtic knots to refresh your memory on how this might all work. I happen to like this technique for something the size of a peppermill, and I found it especially helpful, as I mentioned earlier, to not actually cut all the way through the blank, so that I had a little piece of wood left to keep the blank aligned as I inserted the contrasting wood. That was the biggest thing I had to overcome in doing this, is when I cut all the way through the blank, I had a hard time keeping the two halves aligned when gluing in the other part. All right, so that's my presentation. Are there any questions?